Hello everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am here to go full salt on a very bad book, specifically a very bad craft book. The first craft book I've gotten through in a while. I read it for a reason, and oh, it was bad. It was so bad. So bad that I felt the need to make a standalone video for it. I will also include this in my general reading wrap-up video, but I want to warn people away from buying it just in case they do. So I am talking about How to Write a Damn Good Thriller by James and Frey, and the reason I read this, I'd gotten requests from viewers. What are good craft resources for writing thrillers? And other than some of my own videos and maybe some blog links, I really didn't have many master classes. Another one that came to mind, there are a lot of good thriller writers who have master classes, but you have to pay for it. So I was like, there must be a craft book that perhaps I could take a look at, I could read it, so that I can recommend it to people, because I am not an authority on writing thrillers. I myself am very new to it. So this was the only traditionally published craft book on writing thrillers that I could find, specifically thrillers, which is an important point. And I have been a fan as a viewer for a while of Laura and Kevin's series they're doing where they're reading craft books with a third special guest and reviewing them. So far they've done Save the Cat Writes a Novel, and Lisa Cron, I think it was Wired for Story, and I liked watching those videos. So I went into Laura's DMs and I said, do you want to do this thriller craft book with me? I would love to buddy read it and talk about it. And honestly, it turns out to be the kind of book that you have to go through with someone else, because otherwise you think you're crazy. This book gaslit me so many times. I'm gonna go through why I really didn't like it. But yeah, if you just want to skip the rest of the video and all the fun, salty feelings, don't buy it. That's it. It's not good. I gave it 1 star on Goodreads. It was bad, bad, bad. And there aren't any other traditionally published craft books specifically on thrillers. This isn't even technically about writing thrillers, which I'm gonna get into. And if you do want to watch that live show on this, we had a lot of fun. I will link down below to the live show that we did over the weekend, but this is my standalone salty review. So starting off, this craft book definitely illuminates what I have noticed as a phenomenon in the craft book industry, and at least certainly in traditional publishing. And honestly, I'm not a person who really likes craft books. It's part of that whole pantser thing. I have trouble kind of pinning my brain to prescriptive craft advice. I generally don't like prescriptive craft advice anyway. Writing is so subjective. Anyway, I digress. And a thing about craft books is they're usually for beginner writers, and I've already written a novel, but they're very prescriptive about this is how you write. And I generally don't like them. I've tried reading craft books and they just kind of turn my brain off, and so I stop. The only one I've read all the way through is Save the Cat, not even Save the Cat Writes a Novel. I've read select chapters of that because I really like that you can pick and choose what you read of that craft book. I like that a lot, but I've read enough of it. And then I tried to read The Anatomy of Story by John Truby, and I've looked at others on the shelves. I've looked at them at the bookstore, and James N. Frey is part of a cabal of craft book writers, the type that get greenlit and promoted by traditional publishing is the way to put it. They're mostly, I'm sorry, but they're mostly older white men who came to prominence in their respective industries in a very different time. They are the boomerist of boomers, basically, to get a little generational on you. And literally they're always my mother's age or slightly older. I know that when these people came of age, they're the same age as the professors that I had in college, etc. And most often, most craft books are more screenwriting craft books, and we have to kind of make do as novelists. But even the ones by novelists for novelists, just so often, a lot of the most lauded ones, I should say, tend to be by men of a certain age with a certain kind of area of interest and taste who have limited and specific career experience that doesn't apply to most of us, especially if you are a writer in the year 2020 trying to write a book for the current market. A book written by someone who came to prominence in the 1980s just is not going to help you, and lo and behold, that is largely the case here. The author wrote some pulpy, thrillery novels in the 80s and hasn't written a work of fiction in almost 30 years and has exclusively written craft books like this since the 90s. This one was published in 2010, and even though that is relatively recent, it still shows its age. It could have been written 20 years before that, and I would have believed you. And that's the thing, it's just very, very dated. Most of the examples that it uses are films mostly, not even books, though some of them were based on books, but films from like the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And they're kind of like old, some of them black and white, kind of action-y, western-y thrillers of that time, but they're used as the primary examples for writing a thriller in the year 2020, except I'm not convinced that James N. Frey knows what a thriller is. He repeatedly describes and uses examples for what I would call epics or adventure or action movies. He in fact literally talks about action movies. He's like, Die Hard is a thriller, and I'm like, I guess, except it's really an action movie. Of course, he also said that Quantum of Solace and Casino Royale were thrills a minute, and I'm like, did you see those movies? He and I have very definitions of what a thriller is. He called For Whom the Bell Tolls a thriller. Also, the works of Homer, the Odyssey, he called that a thriller. And in fact, his definition of how to build a thriller, his primary example was the Odyssey. He's very obsessed with the idea that your thriller must have basically an epic, infallible hero and a dastardly, super evil villain, and there's a larger-than-life, impossible odds threat. And basically what he is describing is kind of like action-adventure doomsday fiction, and I don't consider that what a thriller is, certainly not in the current market, or at the least it's not broad enough. He does use some examples, like he uses Bond, classic Bond, spy thriller, yes, subgenre. He talks about a movie from the 90s, I know it was a book too that I do remember, Absolute Power. Yes, that was a thriller at the time that it came out, but a very specific kind of thriller. Basically what James N. Frey is into, and the only thing he talks about in his book, is your dad's thrillers, or your granddad's thrillers, depending on your age and context. Like those books, kind of like The Hunt for Red October, Tom Clancy. It's like the military big hero going on the political world's gonna implode adventure story. Those are the only types of thrillers which I would consider a subgenre of thriller that this author likes, reads, watches, etc. Most of his examples are legit movies, and it's ultimately not very helpful. I did expect going into a book published in the year 2010 that was gonna tell me how to write a damn good thriller to reference some damn good thrillers from that decade. And because there was none of that in the book, as an exercise, I did look up some of the best-selling thrillers of the decade of 2000 to 2010. I actually cut myself off at 2008 to give him the benefit of the doubt for lead time on publishing, because we finish books before they're published. Only one of these is mentioned in the book at all, and it's mentioned so briefly at the beginning that it doesn't count. He should have gone more in depth into this book. So the one book he does actually mention for 2 sentences is The Davinci Code by Dan Brown, and that came out in 2003, which I actually think is a fantastic example. He could have gone in depth analyzing that book. I think it's incredibly instructive to aspiring thriller writers because it's easy to read. Everyone's read it or seen the movie. If you haven't read it, it's easy to read. The chapters are short. It's got excellent pacing. But he just mentions it in passing. But some other famous books from that decade, none of which are mentioned in this book. Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn, which came out in 2008. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, mega hit, which also came out in 2008, which is a very specific kind of thriller. Each of these demonstrate a different kind of thriller, in fact. In the Woods, 2007 by Tana French, actually kind of fits the type he was dancing around, which is kind of the investigator, like the police investigator fiction, which is also a subgenre of thriller. The Lovely Bones, which came out in 2002, an excellent example of an upmarket thriller, again, didn't mention it, Shutter Island, which came out in 2003, was made into a movie after this book came out, but right up his wheelhouse, given it was made into a movie. Really good example of a unreliable narrator psychological thriller, which he kind of glosses over and makes clear he doesn't like psychological thrillers, which is the primary market that sells now, so literally useless. And Darkly Dreaming Dexter, which came out in 2004 and was definitely a TV show by the time this book came out. Another good example he could have used as a modern kind of thrillery series that was very, very popular, but he missed all those opportunities. And he also, in a book about thrillers, not once, mentioned Agatha Christie. And I honestly think that is the #1 selling point for invalidating this entire book. If you are telling someone about thriller canon and writing a good thriller, and you fail to mention "and then there were none," I'm done. It inspired so many modern thriller writers, and in fact we're having a real resurgence of that type of thriller storytelling through writers like Ruth Ware and others. So essentially for me, as an avid reader of thrillers, including and especially thrillers written by women, which the author apparently doesn't care about, I felt like the author demonstrated a lack of authority for speaking about the topic. And then the book calls itself a step-by-step guide to writing a damn good thriller, but it has almost no steps. There's actually literally a part of the book where he says to you, you must write a step sheet if you want to write a good thriller, which is basically, from what I can tell, another word for a beat sheet or an outline. So he's basically saying you can't write thrillers unless you impeccably outline ahead of time, which I kind of disagree with, but that's a whole other topic. But he tells you have to write a step sheet without telling you how to write a step sheet. Yet he promised us a step-by-step guide. The closest that he gets to actually defining what a damn good thriller is, I took some notes. And this is what I really kind of want to get into. There were a few things he said that were okay, and then just most of it was inadequate. So he gave us the 7 pillars of a damn good thriller, which are high stakes, unity of opposites. Don't worry, I'm going to come back to that if you're confused. I was confused and I read the whole book. Seemingly impossible odds, moral struggle, a ticking clock, menace, and thriller-type characters. So I don't have intense quarrels with this. This is like a good starting point for good pillars of a thriller. I even like the way he called that, except the rest of the book does nothing to actually build on any of these ideas, and I do have quibbles. So he specifies that lives should be at stake or something like sanity. Okay. But there are a lot of different ways to have high stakes. And again, because he focused so much on action, adventure, epic style thrillers, in quotes, because I would argue a ton of them are not actually thrillers, he clearly likes that kind of thriller. A bomb's gonna go off if the evil government isn't stopped is his kind of thriller. But there's so many thrillers, which are wildly popular now, where those aren't the high stakes. The high stakes are more like, I'm going to be thrown in jail for this, or people are calling me crazy. I have to prove my sanity / innocence, or I have to avenge someone who was close to me. You can have high stakes, but they can be essentially small and personal, but they're still big in their own way. And I think most writers aren't going to be writing the kind of high stakes that he's advising. So that's kind of how I feel about it. And then unity of opposites is the worst possible name for this. And he's talked about like epic type stuff with heroes and villains. And again, I have a problem with that. But the one thing he said where I'm like, okay, you're not wrong, but why are you calling it this, is the hero can't run away from the challenge. He basically said that if the reader could come up with a good reason why your character could just walk away from the story, that you have essentially a plot hole. And thus that an essential part of a thriller, one of the pillars of a good thriller, is, he calls it unity of opposites. I am just going to say it's a strong motivation for the main character, the investigator character, to be involved, to stay engaged, and to go through the plot. I agree that is an essential pillar of a good thriller. I just hate the name. Seemingly impossible odds is his third one, and I guess, but the problem is that he's so stuck on the epic adventure thing and heroes and villains that he likes all those big things and layering obstacles on top of each other. You are going to do that in a thriller, but seemingly impossible odds, it should feel difficult and full of conflict, but I think he's a little bit overblown on that description. Moral struggle, again, because he's obsessed with heroes and villains, and I would argue a ton of thrillers don't really have what I would call a hero at the center of it, or a straight-up villain. Characters in good thrillers, modern thrillers, commercial thrillers, there's a lot more human nuance to them. They're not, they're not Bond, and they're not Bond villains. He says, your hero is on the side of right against wrong. I don't agree, honestly. In so many of the thrillers that I really love, that we love, you do have to give the reader something to latch onto in terms of some degree of rightness, of moral rightness, but I actually think the kind of morally gray, the anti-hero types, who do have selfish reasons, essentially, to propel themselves through the thriller, I think that could be a lot more compelling than just straight up the hero's on the moral side of the right and the villain is on the moral side of the wrong. I think that's a little bit two-dimensional, to be honest, which is definitely how I would also describe his book. 5 is the ticking clock. I agree with this. Having some kind of constraint within your plotting and your pacing that has a ticking clock, literal or otherwise, a deadline, a time-sensitive nature, keeping your reader aware of time and the idea of the ticking clock, I do think this is essential to a thriller. This is a huge part of building suspense in your pacing, as is the 6th thing he said, which I do also more or less agree with, which he called it menace. This can be menace, it can be a creepy tone. It's kind of how you use conflict to create that pulling feeling in your reader's gut of, I think menace is a good word. And then lastly, he said, thriller type characters, I would just call them archetypes. Thriller type, that's so awkward. Archetypes. I do think that common and popular archetypes are essential to a thriller, and I'm actually, from reading this bad craft book, I'm thinking of lots of videos to do, and I do plan on doing a video on common archetypes and popular archetypes in thrillers. Because as a thriller reader, I would agree. I do expect to see certain types of characters in a thriller. They're kind of like a warm comfort in a thriller, and they do tend to make a thriller stronger and anchor it to the genre. So the only other things that he kind of covered that I kind of like and sparked ideas with me, he talks about the germination of idea, that the base of any good thriller is the germination of idea. Then the irony is he went into a bunch of his own ideas, which is a theme with this book, and I didn't think any of them were good. But I still liked the idea of encouraging writers who are looking at this genre to really latch onto a germination of an idea that is high concept. You can start with a trope, you can start with a motive, and that's the thing, he kind of took it in one direction that I don't think is as helpful to beginner writers. I've expanded on this idea in other videos without calling it the germination of the idea, but it is true. All of my thrillers definitely start with that base of my one coming out next year is competitive college admissions with murder. That's what I needed to get going, and then, everything else kind of builds off of that. So I would agree that good thrillers have that strong core concept. And then probably the best thing he said in the book was that you have to consider the plot behind the plot. This is the best thing in it where I was like, you are completely correct. This is something that I do. This is something that helped me with my thriller and that I would advise others to do, and I'm gonna make a video about it, where you have to consider there's the surface plot, which is literally what the reader is reading, and it's through the POV of your main character, who inevitably, as an investigator character, is going to know less about what is going on because they have to figure it out. And you as the author, you should know the plot behind the plot, which is what is really going on at every step of the way with whomever your antagonist is, with kind of their motives. Where are they? What are they doing? And I agree that mapping that out is incredibly helpful and essential to writing a thriller. I advise actually doing it beforehand, but definitely if you're looking at a revision, you should map that out for your revision. So now that I've covered some of the few things he said, one other thing he did say that I was like, that's interesting. He says that in the first part of your book, your first and second act going into 3, that your main character is on the defense, and then at a certain point you're going to have something happen to switch them to the offense. I'd say that is very true in action type thrillers and is very essential in those, but I also thought was an interesting thing to think about with all thrillers. There's definitely a point where many heroes main characters of thrillers, something happens that kind of snaps them into greater action. So I did actually kind of like that idea. But let's get into more reasons this book is garbage. So I mentioned he gives us his ideas. I think it's like 8 different ideas. None of them are good. All of them have problematic elements, which I know is such a dog whistle, but like legit, the way that he was talking about people of color and women and Native Americans, I was just like, oh, your granddad wrote this, like your granddad, not his granddad though. And they're just boring, honestly. And I think that giving us these fake ideas, I think it doesn't actually really help an aspiring writer. I was expecting this book to be analyzing relevant, popular, contemporary thrillers that people would be familiar with to help you kind of grasp onto real actionable ways to build your thriller. He doesn't do that. And about half of this book, which I spent $16 on it on Kindle, which is too much, and the hardcover is more. Half of this book is his own writing. Once he gets into kind of the plot behind the plot and hero and villain dynamics at every single available turn, when he's not talking about The Day of the Jackal, which is apparently one of his favorite movies, he goes into that example over and over and over again. I happen to have seen it, but I highly doubt most people have. He writes long example excerpts from his fake story ideas. I'm talking pages, pages, pages of his own writing, bad writing, example writing, and I skipped all of it once I realized that was going to be so much of the book. I was skipping to try to get to the salient points about the actual craft, and it never happened. He tells you it's a step-by-step guide, but never actually provides those steps. He does kind of tell you his outline/structure for a mystery and a thriller, because he wrote a book on how to write a damn good mystery, and I wouldn't read that either. And other than that, and those pillars of a thriller, he never actually tells you any of the kind of essential ingredients of a thriller, how to do them. And I wouldn't say I unilaterally agree with his act structure, except, well, let me give you his act structure for a thriller, and you can hear how vague it is. And if you're an aspiring writer watching this, you'll be like, how does that tell me how to write a thriller? Well, the book definitely doesn't. His act structure for a thriller, 5-act structure. He does not like 3-act structure. Act 1 is a gripping opening. Sure, Bob, how do I write a gripping opening? What are the beats? He doesn't tell you. 2, the evil plot gets underway and the hero in terrible trouble fights a defensive battle. This is the defensive versus offensive thing where I was like, okay, I don't hate this. But again, with an evil plot and a hero, okay. Also very vague. How do you do that? What does that mean for Act 2? Act 2s are actually pretty tricky to rate, at least in a 3-act structure. Anyway, Act 3 is the turning point, he says, often a kind of symbolic death and rebirth, where the hero goes on the offensive. Again, I didn't 100% hate this idea. I do like the idea of there being something, essentially it's a twist happening in this section that really changes and reframes things for your hero. Okay, but again, vague. How do you do that? This craft book doesn't tell you. Act 4 is where the hero confronts the villain, who almost always wins, but is finally defeated in a slam-bang climax. Again, yeah, maybe in a Bond story, but I don't really think that helps anyone write a modern thriller. And then Act 5 is the one that I unilaterally agree with, that more people should talk about. I talk about it all the time. I've never called it an act. I don't really think it's an act by itself. It can sometimes just be literally a single chapter, and that is resolution, which tells what happens to the major characters as a result of the hero's victory or defeat. I agree this is an essential part of a thriller that people should not leave out, but again, that's all he gives you. Did that tell you how to write a thriller? I've written one, and that didn't tell me how to write a thriller. So yeah, this book is just a massive waste of time, and the only vaguely helpful things were basic craft things that you could probably find in other books or you can find in videos on the internet. I have written thrillers, and I didn't recognize much in this book that would have helped me a year ago when I was sitting down to write my thriller. Oh gosh, I started a year and a half ago. So a year and a half ago. If I'd read this a year and a half ago, it would have been useless. So yeah, I do not recommend this craft book to anyone who wants to write a thriller, but I have been inspired to make more videos for you because someone's gotta do it. But there was some useful stuff from the live chat that I had with Laura and Kevin again. Some people were saying that there are some good books on writing suspense. So I mentioned like thriller being the operative word. Look for craft books that talk more about building suspense and craft books about mysteries. If you know any good ones, I am blanking on some of the ones that were suggested, but drop them down below in the comments. There are good craft resources for writing suspense, but not for writing thrillers, apparently. So that was my journey with How to Write a Damn Good Thriller by James N. Frey. I hated it. I had a really bad time reading it, but at least it went relatively fast once I realized I could skip half the book because it was his very, very bad writing. Very bad writing I did not want to read. So, let me know down below in the comments, did you also suffer through this book because of the live chat? If so, I apologize. It is literally my fault. What do you think? What are some good actual resources that you recommend that have helped you? What are things you want to know about how to actually write a thriller that would help you, that maybe I can piece together? I am not an expert, but apparently I know more than James N. Frey. So give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I might suffer through some more craft books in order to make videos for you. I really don't enjoy craft books, which I guess makes it more fun to watch me kind of lose my mind. Maybe I'll find one I actually like. I do like the Save the Cat story beats, which is why I talk about them all the time. I guess ultimately you can only take the nuggets that are helpful from a craft book, but this is a craft book that has almost nothing helpful. Like, other ones at least have the nuggets. This one is a flat out waste of money and time. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week, and apparently I'm going to be making a ton of resources for writing thrillers because someone has to. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing and happy not reading this book.